guys, we're going to talk a little bit today about the American and the French Revolutions, as well as a little bit more about Napoleon. We're going to talk a little bit about how the Enlightenment ideas led to these revolutions. So specifically in America, the Enlightenment ideas had inspired the Great Britain's colonists to seek independence, and so they started a new nation based on these Enlightenment ideas. After the 7 Years' War with the French, where the colonists had been forced to keep British troops and also pay for those troops' presence, the colonists were like super PO'd, and so they said, we're going to revolt. And so they especially revolted after the Stamp Act that put a tax on every single piece of paper ever. Merchants in New England felt that it hurt businesses, and so they said, no taxation without representation. And because they didn't have any representation in Parliament back in Great Britain, they were super PO'd, and so they threw all the tea off the boat. The colonists met at the First Continental Congress and started talking about declaring independence or to protest the actions of the British. Thomas Paine wrote a pamphlet called Common Sense that argued that the colonists deserved independence because they had an identity that was completely separate from the British. At this point in the colonists' history, vast majority of the colonists had been born and raised in the United States, and they'd never ever even seen Britain. When the Second Continental Congress met, a committee started to form to write the Declaration of Independence, which included ideas from John Locke, Rousseau, these ideas that all men are created equal, men have a right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and the ideals of equality that had come around with the Enlightenment. In September of 1783, the Americans that were aided by the French forced the British government to formally recognize the Declaration of Independence by signing the Treaty of Paris. These French revolutionaries were super inspired by the American Revolution, and they thought, well, if they overthrew their monarch, why can't we? The Americans signed the Constitution, created the federal system where the federal government or the centralized power came in, and this Constitution included a lot of the Enlightenment ideas, checks and balances, that government exists to serve the people, protection of natural rights, equality of men. And so the American Revolution kind of had a major effect on the French, and thus the French Revolution began. Now, previous to the French Revolution, France had a social and political structure that was called the Three Estates. The king was at the very, very top of that political structure. Then the next level was the First Estate. The First Estate was mainly made up of clergy. They owned about 10% of the land, and they paid like 0 taxes, which was totes unfair. The Second Estate was all nobles, and they were dependent upon the king for jobs. Essentially, the king was holding them a hostage at the Palace of Versailles and essentially making them pay all this money for stuff. And so the Second Estate was a little mad at the king, but they still didn't pay any taxes. The Third Estate was 98% of the overall French population. It included the bourgeoisie, which was the middle class, and the peasants. The Third Estate was really, really upset at the privileges that the First and Second Estate enjoyed. The peasants paid all the taxes, and they had very low wages to pay those taxes with. Members of the Third Estate loved these ideas that came along with the Enlightenment, and they also loved the fact that the American Revolution had overthrown the monarchy in Great Britain over them, and the British had installed a constitutional monarchy limiting the power of the monarch there. In addition to bad harvests and cold weather that kept the peasants super poor and without food, the peasants became cold and they were starving, and it was time for something to change. The First and Second Estate called the king to summon the Estates General. This essentially was a group of people that came together to represent the different estates. The Second Estate wanted to bring the monarch under the control of the Estates General. The Third Estate, however, wanted to change the voting process because they represented 98% of the population, but they didn't have 98% of the overall vote, and they wanted more representation based on the fact that their population was the most out of all of the estates. The Third Estate claimed that they represented the people of France, and they started calling themselves the National Assembly. The National Assembly got locked out of the Estates General because they figured that they were trying to revolt or something, and they instead met across the street from the Estates General at an indoor tennis court, and they decided to take the tennis court oath, in which they vowed to never separate, and they also would continue meeting until they established a constitution. So King Louis ordered troops to Paris in Versailles just in case the monarchy needed to be preserved by force. But this did not go over well with the Third Estate, who really thought that those troops were trying to keep them from meeting to establish this constitution. So the people of France started to arm themselves against the king. They went to this major armory called the Bastille, which was an ancient prison that really traditionally held prisoners who spoke out against the monarchy, and they were looking for weapons. The commander of the Bastille refused to open the doors, but then something bad happened and he started firing into the crowd. The Parisians broke into the Bastille, killed the commander and some guards, released the prisoners, and didn't find any weapons. But the storming of the Bastille overall became a really large symbol of the French Revolution because it was seen as a blow to tyranny, to the power of the king, and it's still celebrated to this day as a movement for independence. So the French Revolution, we can kind of equal out into 4 different phases. The first one is the National Assembly, which we talked about with the Third Estate. The second one is the constitutional monarchy, where that Third Estate really starts to establish the Constitution. The third one is the National Convention that overlaps with the constitutional monarchy and essentially is the legislative body that was built. And then the very last one is the Directory, where like the whole government completely changes. After the French Revolution, we'll talk a little bit about Napoleon, who takes power after the Directory. So, overall, the National Assembly eliminated all of the feudal dues and services that the peasants owed the landowners, as well as the First Estate. They adopted a new Bill of Rights called the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen that was based on these ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity, which they called Liberté, Equalité, Fraternité. That was like the rallying cry of the revolution. In October, though, thousands of women marched from Paris to Versailles, which, just so you know, is about 22 miles, protesting the price of bread. Most of the protests were aimed at the queen because the monarch and his queen were having this like super frivolous lifestyle, so much ice baby, and like all sorts of like really fancy desserts, and they were paying for all these nobles to stay there, and they demanded that the king and his family move back to Paris. So they did. The assembly then disbanded the clergy, they sold all the church lands, tried to pay France's debts that they owned, and they finished the Constitution, which set up the legislative assembly that had power to make laws, collect taxes, decide issues of war and peace. They also decided that all lawmakers would be elected. They kept the monarchy, but they really restricted its power. After the monarchy was done, the king and queen attempted to flee Paris, but they were brought back. And Austria and Prussia, the close by other monarchies, sent troops, so the National Assembly declared war, but the French were quickly defeated because they were super small. Now, the National Assembly voted itself out of existence, and so they called for a brand new legislature called the National Convention. This is super confusing, so keep up. The National Convention was broken into different factions. These factions are kind of like political parties. The sans-culottes that pushed for radical action, radical meaning like this was like really a big change from what it was before, advocated for the formation of a republic. Remember, a republic is a government where people vote for different representatives. The mountains, or otherwise known as the Montagnards, that belonged to the radical group, the Jacobins, represented the interests of the lower middle class and the poor. These are like the peasants. The Girondins were moderates. They kind of were in the middle, and they supported a constitutional monarchy. The plain was made up of swing voters that generally supported the Girondins, but they also kind of support the mountains as well. The king was placed on trial and sentenced to death by guillotine. The National Convention also set up the Committee of Public Safety that was trying to manage the defenses against the foreign forces on France's borders. The committee drafted all of the men to go to war. The Committee of Public Safety was led by Maximilien Robespierre. The convention also set up a court system trying to get rid of anybody who threatened the new French government. During this time, a bunch of different accusations, trials, executions that were carried out by the convention and Robespierre became known as the Reign of Terror. If you had anything that could be considered revolutionary, against the revolution, against the Enlightenment, pro-king, you were put to the guillotine. When the Reign of Terror ended, though, the National Convention wrote another constitution that restricted voting rights of the first constitution, so now instead of all men could vote, only men who own property could vote. The new constitution also set up the Directory, which is a brand new type of government headed by 5 men called directors. There no longer was a major person involved, but instead there was 5 men that were over everything. They started passing financial reforms, trying to help the poor farmers, but they were overall corrupt. They started to try to bring all of the money back to themselves. They argued amongst themselves, and so it was a really weak government overall. So, the rise of Napoleon. Napoleon overthrew the weak directory in a coup d'etat. A coup d'etat is essentially a transfer of power, and he forced the directory out. He installed a 3-man consulate to replace the directory. This consulate voted Napoleon as the head of the council, which essentially made him a dictator. He desired to build an empire for France by ruling Europe, and he started a series of wars that became known overall as the Napoleonic Wars, trying to expand the border of France. Great Britain remained France's greatest enemy overall. He also, in addition to actual military warfare, waged economic warfare called the Continental System, and he closed all of the European ports to British goods. Britain responded with its own blockade, trying to shut off the ports to keep people from moving in or out of those European ports. Both sides started seizing neutral ships, which we'll talk about again in American history, suspected of trading with one another, which caused a lot of issues with the American colonists. Napoleon strengthened the centralized government while he was in power in France by executing his plan to establish order and efficiency. He encouraged new industries, aka factories, built new roads and canals, and even set up public school systems. He made an agreement with the Pope called the Concordat that made peace between France and the Catholic Church. He established the Bank of France to provide economic stability. He also created the Napoleonic Code that made laws uniform and eliminated a lot of the injustices and included many of the Enlightenment principles. Overall, though, Napoleon couldn't stay for very long. Great Britain allied itself with other European powers, and together they all marched all the way into Paris and caused the French to surrender. One of the terms of that surrender was to get rid of Napoleon because they were worried about his power and whether or not he was going to try to invade their different spaces. So he got exiled to Elba. The Allies restored the French monarchy and recognized King Louis as the rightful king of France, redrew the borders to what France had been before Napoleon, but a lot of people feared that the old order, the Third, Second, and First Estates, would return based on the fact that the monarchy was back. Napoleon overall returned to France and was met with cheers and applause because the people thought that he was going to restore the power of France again. And so Napoleon ruled for 100 days before the European allies were able to defeat him again at the Battle of Waterloo. And at this point, they had had enough of him, and they were like, "Bye, Felicia," and sent him all the way to Elba, where he died. The European allies called the Congress of Vienna to create a plan to restore order and stability to France by redrawing the map of Europe. The overall goal was to restore the balance of power, make Europe peaceful again, restore the old monarchies, and compensate the European nations for their losses during the Napoleonic Wars. But the Congress of Vienna changed many of the borders to ensure that France would not regain much of the power. By surrounding France with stronger countries, they created the German Confederation that combined German states and Prussia into one country. That's where we kind of get Germany from. They also required France to pay a lot of money to the European allies to compensate them for the damages during the Napoleonic Wars. So, overall, the revolution was, following the revolution, much of Europe was ruled by a bunch of the monarchies, but the monarchs didn't retain the same power that they had prior to the revolution. The common people now had a right to equal treatment under the law and a lot more equality than they had enjoyed previous to the French Revolution. Common people also started to feel a lot more empowered against their rulers, and they started to use their influence over the monarchs to get what they wanted. The Enlightenment ideals also became very popular, and revolutionary thinking led to widespread revolutions all across the world, including Latin America and Haiti, all the way to Romania and some of the other European countries. Thanks for joining me for this video. Jillian says hello, and we'll see you a little bit later, guys.